A hungry wolf's howl sliced through the crisp stillness of the February night. Burrin, an old hunting dog, lunged at the door with such ferocity that Gregory instinctively clutched his rifle. "What now, boy?" grumbled the former park ranger, struggling out from under his warm quilt. "Helen, are you awake?" His wife, nestled beside him, merely mumbled something in her sleep. The television still hummed in the corner of the room, an old British spy movie playing to an empty audience. The clock on the wall showed 1:30 in the morning. "Burrin!" Gregory snapped, but the dog wouldn't calm down, scratching at the door and making strange noises, a mix of growls and whines. Odd. In his 30 years serving in the Canadian wilderness, Gregory Vorontsov had seen a lot, but old Burrin had never behaved like this. Wolves in February were dangerous, hungry, desperate. They'd come closer to human dwellings than usual. But this howl, there was something unusual about it. His feet, clad in heavy waterproof boots, hit the cold floor. The old man pulled a fleece vest over his nightshirt and took down his old Winchester rifle from the hook by the door, a faithful companion for the last 40 years. "Let's see," he muttered into the empty air, knowing Helen wouldn't hear him anyway. Years of marriage had taught him not to bother her with trifles. The mudroom greeted him with a raw dampness. Burrin paced frantically by the door leading outside, unable to settle. "Quiet, you," his owner admonished, but the dog just whimpered pitifully, looking at him with intelligent, almost human eyes. "All right, what is it?" Gregory slid back the heavy bolt and cracked the door open. The biting cold air hit his face, making him squint for a moment, 20 below zero at least. Burrin slipped between his owner's legs and shot towards the old shed where firewood and hunting gear were stored. Moonlight flooded the snowy yard, transforming an ordinary rural homestead into a scene from a fairy tale. The small town of Timberline was asleep, only a few lights occasionally flickering in the windows of other sleepless old-timers. "What in the—" the ranger began, but stopped short when he saw the dog halt by the shed's half-open door. Gregory slowly raised his rifle. Instincts, honed by decades of service, took over. He moved silently, just as he had in his youth, tracking poachers in the deep woods. The snow crunched treacherously under his boots, but the ranger knew where to step to make as little noise as possible. Burrin froze by the door, not daring to enter. This was unusual. Normally, the dog would be the first to charge at any danger. "Back," Gregory whispered, and surprisingly, the dog obeyed. The ranger approached the shed, rifle at the ready. He gently pushed the door with the barrel, and it swung wider with a soft creak. Inside, it was almost completely dark, with only a thin beam of moonlight piercing through a small window under the roof. Gregory took another step and froze. From the far corner, cushioned with old hay, came heavy, ragged breathing. A large animal lay there, gasping for air. The ranger squinted, trying to make out the uninvited guest. A wolf, large, gray with matted fur. She lay on her side, her flanks heaving with each difficult breath. But the most surprising thing was that she didn't attack the human, didn't growl, didn't even try to stand. "Well, look at that!" Gregory exhaled, lowering his rifle. He took another cautious step and saw crusted blood on the animal's front paw. The wound was fresh, no more than a day old, and the wolf's belly looked unusually large. "I see what's going on with you," the ranger murmured. "You're about to give birth, and now you're injured." He stepped back, closed the shed door, and pondered. February was not the best time for wolf births. It usually happened in March or April, but global warming had messed with natural cycles even here in the heart of the Canadian wilderness. "Burren, home!" he commanded the dog, who continued to sniff nervously at the crack under the door. "Stay inside, understand?" The dog reluctantly followed its owner. In the mudroom, Gregory locked the dog in, then returned to the warmth of the house. "Greg," Helen mumbled sleepily, sitting up in bed. "What was that?" "Go back to sleep, dear," the ranger said softly. "I'll tell you in the morning." But instead of returning to bed, he walked to the old hutch, pulled out a worn, leather-bound notebook, and began flipping through the pages. It was his observation journal, which he'd kept since his first day on the job. Reaching entries from 12 years ago, he stopped. April 17th, 2003, poachers in Sector 24W. 3 men in a pickup truck with out-of-province plates confiscated 2 unregistered rifles, rescued a wolf pup, female, 2-3 months old, distinctive mark, black spot on her chest. Gregory slowly closed the notebook. One thought spun in his head. Could it be her? Before we continue, please tell us what city you are from again. Subscribe, like, and watch until the end. We are starting. Helen woke to the smell of freshly brewed herbal tea. Her husband stood by the wood-burning stove, tinkering with a cast-iron pot, tossing in some roots and leaves. "Greg, what happened?" she asked, pulling a shawl around her shoulders. "We have a guest, Helen," he replied without turning around. "In the shed, an injured wolf, due to give birth soon." Helen gasped. "Good heavens! Now what?" "Now what?" Gregory shrugged. "We help her. We can't just turn her out in this condition." A former district nurse, Helen Thompson, had seen her share of wounds and illnesses, but never had she treated a wild animal. "You're out of your mind, old man." She shook her head. "What if she bites? You know how many diseases they carry." "She won't bite," the ranger said confidently. "She came for help." "How do you know?" Gregory was silent, stirring the concoction in the pot. "Remember, I told you about the pup I rescued from those poachers? It's her, Helen, the very one." "No way," his wife disbelieved. "It's been so many years. And how did you know?" "A spot on her chest," he simply replied. "Black as pitch. Other wolves don't have them." Helen walked to the window. Outside, a gray winter dawn was breaking. Timberline was slowly waking up. Chimneys smoked, dogs barked, snow crunched under the feet of early morning passers-by. "If anyone finds out," she began. "They won't," Gregory cut her off. "This is our business, Helen." He took the pot off the stove and poured the brew into a large clay bowl. "Here," he said, pulling his wife's old medical kit from the cupboard. "You take this, and I'll lock Burren in the house so he doesn't get in the way." Stepping out into the yard, Helen involuntarily shivered. The frost was so intense that her breath instantly turned to clouds of vapor. The deep woods surrounded the settlement on all sides, dark, harsh, primal. Somewhere in the thicket, a wolf pack, who had lost their female, was lurking. "Come on, dear," her husband urged, and together they headed for the shed. The wolf lay exactly where Gregory had left her the night before. She raised her head at their approach, but showed no aggression. "My goodness, she's huge," Helen whispered, instinctively stepping back. "Don't be afraid," her husband encouraged her. "She knows we've come to help." He slowly approached the animal and carefully knelt beside her. The wolf watched him with wary yellow eyes, but didn't growl. "Hand me your supplies, Helen," Gregory said. "We need to clean the wound." The next hour passed in tense silence. Helen, overcoming her initial fear, skillfully cleaned the wound, applied medicinal ointment to the wolf's paw, and bandaged it. All this time, the animal lay still, only occasionally flinching in pain. There, the woman finally exhaled, stepping back. It'll heal like a dog's. You bet, Gregory chuckled. Wolves and dogs are kin, after all. He placed a bowl of herbal brew and a bowl of water before the wolf. Drink, Gray One. You'll need your strength. To their surprise, the wolf indeed began to lap up the liquid, grimacing at the bitter taste, but continuing to drink. Let's go, Gregory told his wife. She needs peace, and it's time for us to make breakfast. When they left the shed, the cold February sun was already shining brightly. Peter Smith, a neighbor and old acquaintance, was tinkering with his fence, nailing something. "Morning, Greg," he called out. "Still busy in your shed, are you? Still obsessed with hunting?" "Just a few odds and ends," Gregory replied, trying to sound nonchalant. "What are you doing out in the cold so early?" "Oh, just fixing the gate," the neighbor replied. "Heard the news? Hunters from the Shire capital came yesterday. Say they tracked a wolf pack. Got 3 of them, the rest scattered." Gregory's heart skipped a beat. So that's why the injured wolf had come to humans. She was fleeing the hunters. "Oh, really?" he said as indifferently as possible. "And how many of them are there?" "Who's counting?" Peter shrugged. "But they say they're a menace this year. Killing livestock, coming close to the villages. My cousin in Maplewood, they lost 3 sheep last week." Gregory nodded and hurried into the house. Helen was already busy by the stove, stoking the fire. "Did you hear?" he asked, closing the door tightly. "I heard," she replied quietly. "What do we do now?" The ranger thought for a moment. "We need to move her," he finally said. "The shed is too close to the house. If the men come back, they might smell her." "And where to?" his wife asked, surprised. "It's freezing outside." "I know a place," Gregory said slowly. "An old ranger's cabin 5 miles from here. No one will find us there." "You're mad!" Helen threw up her hands. 5 miles through the snow with an injured wolf. How do you imagine that? "I'll borrow a sled from Mike," the ranger persisted. "I'll say I'm bringing firewood from the forest. We'll wrap the wolf in a blanket, put her on the sled, and off we go. Burrin will run behind, covering our tracks." Helen shook her head. "Greg, you're 65. What sled? What forest? You'll ruin yourself and the wolf." "What do you suggest?" The old man suddenly flared up. "Hand her over to those men to tear apart, after she came to us for help?" The woman sighed. In 40 years of marriage, she had come to know her husband well. Once he'd made up his mind, there was no changing it. "All right," she relented, "but I'm coming with you." "No way," Gregory objected. "We'll have to spend the night there. Cold, no amenities." "I've worked as a nurse my whole life," Helen replied calmly, "including in the field. Don't forget I went on expeditions with geologists when I was young. Besides, if the wolf gives birth on the way, who will help her? You?" Gregory wanted to argue, but he realized his wife was right. He couldn't manage alone. "Fine," he reluctantly agreed. "Just get ready quickly. We need to leave while it's still light." Meanwhile, Helen didn't waste time. She prepared a bed, layering it with a thick layer of dry hay, old blankets, and clean rags. "We'll lay her here," she said when her husband returned with the borrowed sled. "And I've been thinking—" She handed him an old sheepskin coat that had been hanging in the closet for ages. "So she doesn't freeze," Helen explained. "She'll be shaking for 5 miles in the cold." "Oh, Helen," Gregory smiled, "you treat her like a person. She's a wild animal. She's used to it." "Used to it or not, she's injured," Helen retorted, "and pregnant, and it's 30 below zero. I've even prepared some hot water bottles. We'll place them around her. She'll be warm." Gregory just shook his head but didn't argue. By noon, they were ready. The wolf was wrapped in an old blanket, placed on the sled, surrounded by hot water bottles, and covered with a sheepskin coat. The animal was weakened by her injury and didn't resist. Burrin was tied to the sled. He was to help pull the load. Well, with God's speed, Helen crossed herself as they left the yard. The journey was tough. The snow was deep, knee-high in places, and the sled kept getting stuck. Gregory and Helen took turns pulling it, exhausting themselves. Burrin ran alongside, sometimes ahead, blazing a trail. "Let's rest a bit," Gregory suggested when they had covered about half the distance. They stopped by a large pine tree. Helen checked on the wolf. To her surprise, she didn't look frozen. The sheepskin coat and hot water bottles were doing their job. "How are you doing, Gray One?" Helen asked, adjusting the dislodged blanket. "Hang in there. We'll be there soon." The wolf watched her with her yellow eyes, and Helen felt as if the animal understood everything. "You know, Greg," she said, walking over to her husband, "sometimes I think they're smarter than us." "Who?" Gregory didn't understand. "These animals, wolves, foxes. We think we know everything about them, but look at them. They understand everything, they feel everything. Maybe they can even talk, but we just can't hear them." Gregory chuckled. "You've been reading too many fairy tales, dear." He pulled a thermos of tea from his backpack. "Here, drink something hot. You're freezing." They drank tea, passing the single mug back and forth, and watched the wolf, who was dozing on the sled, wrapped in the sheepskin coat. "We've adopted a new one, as it were," Gregory joked, "or rather, taken in a wolf. Now we have to raise her, feed her, then send her to college." Helen burst out laughing. "I can just picture it. A wolf sitting at a desk in glasses, writing notes." "Exactly," Gregory added, and defending her thesis, methods of hunting rabbits in the conditions of the Canadian wilderness. "And the professor says, 'Respected Ms. Wolf, how do you justify your method?' And she goes, 'Howl.'" They laughed, and Burrin, not understanding the reason for their amusement, but sensing his owner's good mood, barked joyfully. "Quiet, you!" Helen shushed him. "You'll wake our charge." But the wolf wasn't asleep. She watched the humans, and in her gaze was something akin to bewilderment, as if she was trying to understand what was going on with them. "Well, shall we continue?" Gregory suggested, finishing his tea. "We still have about 2 hours to go." By evening, they reached the old ranger's cabin. It was a small log cabin in the middle of the forest, almost completely buried in snow. Once it had been a checkpoint for forest wardens, but since Gregory had been let go, the cabin had stood abandoned. "We'll get a fire going," the ranger promised, shoveling snow from the cabin entrance. "It'll be warm." Inside, it was damp and chilly, but the stove, fortunately, was intact, and in the corner lay a supply of firewood Gregory had left back when he regularly patrolled the area. Within an hour, the cabin was warm. The wolf was settled on a bed made of an old quilted jacket. Helen examined her wound. It had begun to heal, but still looked nasty. "We need to clean it with antiseptic," she said, "and change the dressing." While his wife was busy with the treatment, Gregory stepped outside. It had grown dark. The endless snowy forest stretched around the cabin. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howl could be heard. "They've found her," the ranger murmured. "Her pack is looking for her." He returned to the cabin and told Helen. "Maybe we should let her go," she suggested. "Let her go back to her own kind." "Can't." Gregory shook his head. "With that wound and close to birthing, she won't get far. She'll freeze, or the men will shoot her. Let her give birth here, get strong, and then we'll see." The night passed restlessly. The wolf kept getting up, pacing the cabin, then lying back down. It was clear that labor was imminent. "It'll start soon," Helen whispered to her husband. "In 2 or 3 hours." They sat by the stove, stoking the fire, and waited. Outside, a blizzard howled, or perhaps it was wolves. It was hard to tell any more. "Remember how we met?" Gregory suddenly asked, gazing at the fire in which images from the past seemed to dance. Helen smiled, and the wrinkles around her eyes gathered like rays, like a young girl's. "How could I forget? Spring of '79, the flood. You brought that boy with the dislocated leg to the clinic." She paused. "Little Alex Carter. You carried him 2 miles across the flooded river on your back." "And you scolded me," Gregory chuckled. "What are you doing, Ranger? So irresponsible. You could drop the child, hurt your back." "I was strict," Helen nodded. "I wanted to make an impression on the young specialist from town. City boy, I thought, educated, and I was just a country nurse. But then, when I walked you home, the moon was shining so brightly," Helen continued, "and the cherry trees were in blossom, and you talked about the stars, pointed out constellations, and I thought then, this is the man I want to spend my life with." Gregory reached out and touched her wrinkled hand. "And a month later, I brought you your first flowers." "Buttercups," Helen nodded. "A whole bouquet of orange buttercups. I dried them and put them in a book. They're still somewhere." "In War and Peace," Gregory reminded her. "The part about Natasha Rostova." They fell silent, gazing at the fire, remembering their youth. Back then, in 1979, Gregory had just started working as a ranger after college in Vancouver, and Helen was a young nurse, assigned to the area after nursing school. Their meeting changed everything. "Greg," Helen suddenly said quietly, stroking her husband's calloused hand, "do you remember how much we wanted a baby? How we planned everything, chose names?" The ranger flinched. This topic had always been painful for them. They hadn't had children. It just hadn't happened. Doctors were never able to explain why. "I remember," he replied just as quietly. "How could I not? We wanted a daughter, to name her Hope, after your mother. And then a son, Alex, after your grandfather," Helen continued. "You would have been a good mother," Gregory sighed. "And you a good father," she echoed. Helen wiped away a tear. "You know, I thought I'd made peace with it. So many years have passed. But now, looking at this wolf with her cubs, it all comes back." She didn't finish, but Gregory understood. "Maybe it's fate," the woman continued, nodding toward the wolf. "Maybe we were destined not to raise our own children, but to save animals like this, to protect the forest, to help those who need protection." "You know," Gregory said slowly, looking at the fire, "maybe you're right. My father always said, every person has their own path in the forest of life. Ours, it seems, led through the wilderness, through wolf trails. Not every family with children has as much love as you and I have had all these years," she said, not turning around. and not every child grows up to be a kind person. But we probably helped many in our own way. And your students, those interns from the Institute, remember? Dozens passed through you, and to each of them, you didn't just pass on forest wisdom, but you poured your soul into them. Gregory felt a lump in his throat. Helen was right. For over 20 years, he had supervised forestry students, and many of them still called, wrote, visited. To some, he had become a second father. At that moment, the wolf suddenly let out a loud whine and thrashed about on her bed. "It's starting," Helen said, jumping up. "Come on, Greg, heat some water." The next 2 hours passed in a blur. Helen, recalling her medical skills, helped the wolf as much as possible. Gregory boiled water, provided clean rags, and followed his wife's commands. By dawn, it was all over. On the bed, nestled against their mother's side, 5 small, blind wolf pups squirmed. 5, Gregory whispered, "a whole pack." "Beautiful," Helen smiled, wiping sweat from her brow. "And all healthy, strong." The wolf licked her cubs, occasionally glancing at the humans. In her eyes, there was no longer fear, only exhaustion and a new feeling akin to trust. "Now what?" Helen asked when they moved back to the stove. "Now we wait," Gregory replied, "until both mother and cubs are strong, and then nature will decide." They stayed in the cabin for a whole week. Every day Gregory went hunting to bring food for the wolf. Helen cared for her and the pups, changed their bedding, and treated the wound. On the 8th day, the wolf stood on all fours for the first time and, limping, circled the cabin. The wound had almost healed, and she had regained strength. She walked to the door and whimpered softly, looking at Gregory. "Want to be free?" he asked. "It's still too early, Gray One. Wait a bit longer." But the wolf was persistent. She scratched at the door with her paws, then went to the bed with the pups, then back to the door. It seemed she was trying to say something. "Maybe she wants her pack to come here," Helen suggested. "Maybe it would be better for them all to be together." Gregory thought for a moment. Wolves were intelligent creatures. If the female had decided it was time to rejoin her pack, then that was it. "All right," he finally said. "We'll try." In the evening, when darkness fell, Gregory opened the cabin door. The wolf slipped out and disappeared into the forest. The pups remained on the bed, whimpering softly. "Did she abandon them?" Helen gasped. "How could she?" "She didn't abandon them," the ranger said confidently. "She'll be back. We'll keep watch for now." They sat by the window, peering into the darkness. The moon illuminated the clearing in front of the cabin, and tracks leading into the forest were clearly visible in the snow. An hour passed, then another. Suddenly, Burrin, who had been lying by the stove, raised his head and tensed. "Someone's coming," Gregory whispered, grabbing his rifle. The wolf emerged into the clearing. Behind her, in single file, followed 4 more wolves, large, gray, and wary. "There's the pack," Helen breathed. "They came after all." The wolf stopped at the cabin door and whimpered. Gregory slowly opened the door. The animal slipped inside, walked to the bed with the pups, and began to sniff them. "And these?" Helen nodded towards the other wolves who remained in the clearing. "They'll wait," Gregory replied. "They're not foolish. They won't enter a human dwelling." After a while, the wolf again approached the door. It was clear. She wanted to leave and take her pups with her. "Well," the ranger sighed, "time to say goodbye, Gray One." He took an old canvas sack from his backpack, lined it with rags, and carefully, one by one, transferred the pups into it. "Here," he said, placing the sack on the floor in front of the wolf. "Your offspring." To his surprise, the wolf didn't snatch the sack as he expected. Instead, she walked to the door, scratched with her paws, and whimpered softly, as if calling someone. "What is it?" Gregory wondered. "Who are you calling?" The answer came immediately. A low growl was heard outside the door, and when the ranger carefully opened it, he saw 4 large wolves sitting on the threshold. They watched the human warily, but showed no aggression. "Well, I'll be." Gregory shook his head. "You called your kin for help." The wolves entered the cabin one by one, sniffed the sack of pups, and at the wolf's command, she let out a short growl. Each grabbed a pup and carried it outside. The wolf herself took the last, smallest one and headed for the exit. At the threshold, she turned as if saying goodbye and disappeared into the night. Gregory and Helen stepped onto the porch. The wolf pack surrounded the female and her cubs, sniffing them. Then, one by one, the wolves melted into the forest. "That's it," Helen said softly. "They're gone." "Not at all." Gregory shook his head. "This is just the beginning. Now we have our own pack in the forest, with our mark." 3 months passed. Spring arrived. The snow had almost melted, revealing last year's grass and the first tentative shoots. Gregory and Helen returned to their normal lives. The villagers talked about the strange behavior of the wolves. They no longer approached the settlement, didn't bother livestock, and avoided hunters. "They've gotten smart," the men whispered in the general store. "They sensed danger." Gregory merely smirked into his beard. He knew the real reason. One April morning, stepping onto the porch, the ranger noticed something strange on the doorstep. He looked closer and gasped. On the steps lay fresh prey, a young rabbit, still warm. "Helen!" he called to his wife. "Come look." Helen came out onto the porch and threw up her hands. "Good heavens! Where did that come from?" "From her," Gregory simply replied. "From the gray one. She's thanking us." From then on, such offerings began to appear regularly. Sometimes a rabbit, sometimes a partridge, and once even a piece of moose meat. Always at dawn, always on their doorstep. "What will people say?" Helen worried. "They'll notice." "What about it?" Gregory shrugged. "We'll say I hunted it. Who's going to check?" One morning, stepping into the yard early, the ranger saw the wolf. She stood by the gate, holding a rabbit carcass in her jaws. Beside her, hidden behind her paws, huddled 5 grown pups. Seeing the human, the wolf placed the prey on the ground and stepped back a few paces, never taking her eyes off Gregory. "Thank you, Gray One," he said softly. "You shouldn't have bothered." The wolf tilted her head, as if understanding human speech. Their eyes met, and at that moment Gregory saw something in those yellow animal eyes that took his breath away. Understanding, gratitude, and a strange, almost mystical connection, as if an invisible thread linked human and wild beast. Then the wolf turned, and with one fluid motion disappeared into the undergrowth. The pups followed her, gray shadows among the green, like ghosts, silent and nimble. Only the smallest, lagging behind the others, turned and cast a final glance at the human before vanishing into the thicket. Gregory stood for a long time, watching them go. A strange thought spun in his head. Nothing in nature is accidental. Every encounter, every event, part of a larger pattern that we are not always able to discern. The forest all around breathed, lived its own life. The wind rustled in the pine tops. A woodpecker tapped somewhere. A hawk soared high in the sky. The human amidst this eternal cycle of life, was both ruler and guest. The forest remembers everything. Gregory's father, an old hunter, often used to say, both good and evil, and it returns everything tenfold. When Gregory told Helen about it, she didn't immediately believe him. "She brought her cubs to show you?" she asked, surprised. "Like relatives?" "Something like that." The ranger nodded. "Wolves have their own laws, but gratitude and loyalty, that's in their blood, and something else." "What?" Helen asked, tilting her head. "Memory," Gregory simply replied. "They forget nothing, neither good nor bad." Typhoon, the young dog, unlike his predecessor Burin, was suspicious of wolves. When the wolf with the black spot first came to their house after the old dog's passing, Typhoon barked so furiously that he woke up the entire neighborhood. "Quiet, you silly dog," Gregory soothed him. "These are our friends." But the dog didn't believe it. He growled at the gray visitor, bared his teeth, showing with his whole demeanor that he was ready to defend his territory to the last. "He's jealous," Helen laughed, watching the scene. "He thinks we're cheating on him with wild animals." "Nonsense!" Gregory dismissed it, but deep down he knew his wife was right. Over time, however, Typhoon grew accustomed to the wolf's nightly visits. He no longer barked at her appearance, although he remained cautious. And when the wolf began bringing them gifts of prey, the dog developed a respect for her, especially after Gregory started sharing pieces of fresh meat with him. "Clever rascal!" The ranger shook his head, watching Typhoon devour his share. "Now you probably wait for her every time yourself." And indeed, sometimes it seemed the dog sensed the wolf's approach before his owners and met her at the gate, not with a bark, but with a welcoming whimper, like an old acquaintance. Another 6 months passed. Autumn arrived, and with it a new hunting season. Hunters from neighboring villages and even from the Shire capital converged on Timberline. They all spoke of one thing: an elusive wolf pack. "Vanished into thin air," complained the game warden from Maplewood. "Before, you could track them anywhere, but now, not a trace, not a howl." "They've gotten smart," the men repeated. "They sense danger." But Gregory knew the truth. Several times, going into the forest for mushrooms or berries, he noticed gray shadows in the distance, following him. The pack guarded their human, just as he had once guarded them. Surprisingly, the locals' attitude towards wolves gradually changed. If everyone had previously seen them only as a threat, now many noticed that with the arrival of the smart pack, as it was called in the settlement, there were fewer stray dogs, fewer rats at the dump, and even the foxes, who sometimes stole chickens, had disappeared somewhere. "The wolves must have driven them out," the old men mused on the bench. "Put things in order in their forest." Gregory listened to such conversations and smiled into his beard. No one, except him and Helen, knew that the pack had a special relationship with humans, or rather, with one specific human family. One such day, Gregory stumbled upon poachers. 3 men in camouflage were butchering a recently killed moose cow, judging by her swollen udder, a nursing female. "Hey!" the ranger shouted, stepping out from behind the trees. "What's going on here?" The poachers turned. They were the same 3 who had tormented the wolf pup 10 years ago. They had aged, grown paunchy, but Gregory recognized them instantly. "Well, look at that!" one of the leaders sneered. "The old ranger! You're still alive, you old geezer?" "Alive as you can see," Gregory replied calmly, "and you're illegally hunting in a protected area, again." "Oh, come on." The second poacher waved him off. "Just a moose cow. There are plenty of them here. No one will even notice." "I noticed," the ranger said, "and I have this." He pulled a cell phone from his pocket. "I filmed you. I'm sending it to the police now. Let them deal with it." The leader made a move towards him, but suddenly froze. From the forest, surrounding the clearing, wolves silently emerged, large, gray, with bared fangs. "Oh, for crying out loud!" One of the poachers whispered, "Wolves!" There were 7 of them, 5 young, almost adult, and 2 seasoned animals. In front of them all walked the wolf, with the black spot on her chest. "Don't move," Gregory commanded, "and no one gets hurt." "What the heck?" the leader managed to say. "Do they listen to you?" The ranger didn't reply. He silently gazed at the wolf, and she returned his attentive look. "All right, gentlemen," Gregory said after a pause. "Drop your weapons and leave, slowly, and don't ever come back here." The poachers exchanged glances. They had no choice. The wolves surrounded the clearing in a tight circle, cutting off their retreat. All right," the leader mumbled, dropping his rifle to the ground. "We're leaving. Just tell your friends not to bother us." Gregory nodded to the wolf, and she stepped aside, clearing a path. The poachers, abandoning their prey and weapons, quickly retreated. When they were out of sight, the ranger approached the killed moose and shook his head. Too late to save her. The wolf approached him and nudged his hand with her muzzle. Her children, the same pups born in the forest cabin, kept a little distance, watching warily. "Thank you, Gray One," Gregory said, stroking the wolf's head. "Couldn't have done it without you." He surveyed the poacher's abandoned prey and made a decision. "Take it," he said, stepping away from the carcass. "It'll go to waste anyway, and you need food." The wolf bowed her head, as if thanking him, then gave a soft yap. The young wolves immediately rushed to the prey, beginning to tear at the meat. Gregory stood for a little longer, watching the feast, then quietly walked away. He knew the wolf pack would escort him all the way home, though he wouldn't see them. Returning to the settlement, the ranger found the local constable at his gate, a young officer recently assigned to their district. "Mr. Vorontsov," the officer asked, "can I have a word with you?" "Of course," the ranger nodded. "Come on in." Over tea, the constable explained that 3 poachers had been apprehended in the forest. They were scared half to death and rambling something about wolves, allegedly following the commands of the local ranger. "Can you imagine?" The officer smiled. "They say you have a whole wolf army up there, trained no less." "They'll make up anything to excuse themselves," Gregory shrugged. "That's what I thought." The constable nodded. "But it is a strange story. Wolves in our forests have indeed been acting unusually lately, not attacking livestock, avoiding villages." "Nature," the ranger simply replied. "It has its own laws." When the constable left, Helen asked, "Aren't you afraid the truth will come out?" "What truth?" Gregory chuckled. "That we helped an injured wolf? That's not a crime. And friendship with wild animals, who would believe that?" 5 years passed. Gregory and Helen had grown older, but still lived in their house on the edge of timberline. Much had changed in those years. The wilderness that surrounded the settlement had thinned. In the summer of 2018, a terrible fire had destroyed hundreds of acres of forest. Gregory, despite his age, had joined other residents to fight the fire, trying to save what he had dedicated his life to. "See what's happening?" he would say to Helen, returning home black with soot and smoke. The climate is changing. We never had such heat before, and now every summer is like a furnace. Helen would only sigh, applying compresses of herbal infusions to his burned hands. Man digs his own grave, she agreed, cutting off the branch he's sitting on. After the fire, many wild animals moved deeper into the mountains, escaping the disaster. But the wolf pack, to Gregory's surprise, stayed. They settled in a part of the forest untouched by the fire closer to the river and continued their invisible coexistence with humans. People occasionally saw wolves from a distance, but they never approached human dwellings. Only to the old ranger's house, sometimes at night, would a large wolf with a black spot on her chest come. She would leave prey on the doorstep and disappear into the forest before anyone could notice her. One such night, Gregory woke with a strange feeling. Something was wrong. He listened and distinguished a soft whimper at the door. "Who's there?" he asked, stepping into the mudroom. The wolf stood at the door, but not alone. Beside her, pressed against her side, stood a young wolf with the same black mark on his chest, one of her children, now grown. "Hello, Gray One," the ranger said softly. "Who have you brought?" The wolf whimpered and nudged her offspring closer to the door. Gregory looked closer and noticed the young wolf was limping on his front paw. A fresh, deep wound was bleeding. "Again?" The old man shook his head. "Well, come in." He opened the door wider, letting the animals into the house. The wolf, just as many years ago, entered without fear. Her son remained wary, but still followed his mother. "Helen," Gregory called, "wake up. We have guests." Helen, despite being 70-something, still retained her sharpness of mind and steady hand. She quickly examined the young wolf's wound. "A trap," she said confidently. "A poacher's trap. Barbed, new design. Scoundrels, at it again." Treating the wound took about an hour. All this time, the wolf sat nearby, watching the human's actions intently. Her son endured the pain silently, only occasionally whimpering when Helen treated particularly deep parts of the wound. "Look at him," Helen said quietly to her husband when they moved to the stove to put on the kettle. "His eyes are just like hers, and the spot is almost the same." "Heredity," Gregory nodded. "Nature always claims its own." "And trust?" Helen asked. "Is that also heredity?" Gregory pondered. "No," he slowly replied. "That's something else. She taught him, showed him that not all humans are enemies." The young wolf raised his head and looked at them, as if understanding what they were talking about. There was no fear in his gaze, only cautious curiosity. "That's it," Helen finally said, applying a bandage. "Now he needs a week of rest, no hunting or chases." The wolf, as if understanding, gratefully licked Helen's hand. She smiled shyly. "Oh, come on, Gray One. What are we, not human or something?" When dawn broke, the wolves left, just as quietly as they came. Gregory walked them to the gate and watched them for a long time until they disappeared into the forest. "What are you thinking about?" Helen asked, coming up behind him and putting her arms around his shoulders. "About life," he replied, "about how everything in this world is intertwined. A man saved a wolf pup, a wolf came to a man for help, now her children come, and it will always be so as long as the forest lives." "And as long as we live," Helen added. They stood there a little longer, watching the rising sun, then returned to the house. And in the snow remained tracks, human and wolf, walking side by side, as a symbol of an ancient alliance between nature and man. The next night, Gregory couldn't sleep. Something was troubling him, some vague premonition. He went out onto the porch and stared at the stars for a long time, trying to understand what was bothering him. An unusual silence hung in the air, no rustle, no sound, as if the forest was holding its breath. And suddenly, from somewhere far away, a shot rang out. Then a second, a third. "Poachers!" Gregory whispered, and his heart tightened with a bad feeling. Without hesitation, he went back inside, quickly dressed, grabbed his rifle, and went out into the yard. Typhoon, sensing his owner's distress, rushed to him. "Come on, boy," Gregory told the dog. "Looks like we're in for trouble." They moved towards the forest. Despite his age, Gregory still navigated well in the dark. Once he could walk through his entire section with his eyes closed, knowing every tree, every bush. Now, after the fire, much had changed, but the main trails remained the same. The further they went into the forest, the clearer the sounds became. Voices, crackling branches growling. Emerging into a small clearing, Gregory saw what he had feared. 3 men with flashlights and rifles surrounded something lying on the ground. His heart sank. In the snow, in a pool of blood, lay a wolf with a black spot on its chest, the very one he and Helen had treated the day before. Beside him, baring her teeth, stood the mother wolf, ready to defend her offspring to the last. "Well, bitch, you got caught?" One of the poachers sneered, raising his rifle. "Now you'll join your son." "Stop!" Gregory shouted loudly, stepping into the clearing. "Forest Service!" The poachers turned. They were strangers to Gregory, young men, clearly from out of town. "Who are you, old man?" one of them asked insolently. "Clear off before you get hurt." "I'm Gregory Vorontsov, Senior Park Ranger for this section," Gregory introduced himself, raising his rifle. "And who are you and what are you doing here?" "What ranger?" another poacher wondered. "We were told no one patrols here. Free zone." "Who told you?" Gregory asked. "What does it matter?" The first one waved him off. "We came for pelts. We have an order. They pay good money." "For wolves?" Gregory clarified. "You're dealing in protected species? That's a serious offense, by the way." "Listen, old man," the third poacher, the largest one, intervened. "You're one, and there are 3 of us. So shut your mouth and get lost before we shoot you. We'll say self-defense. Who's going to check?" Gregory felt a chill run down his spine. They were right. He was alone, an old man, against 3 young armed men. But there was nowhere to retreat. "I'm not leaving," he said firmly, "and you will put down your weapons and slowly step away from the wolves." The poachers exchanged glances and burst out laughing. "Are you crazy, old man?" the first one asked. "Risking your life for some mangy creatures?" "They're not creatures," Gregory replied softly. "They're my friends." At that moment, something unexpected happened. Typhoon, who had been standing silently beside his owner, suddenly made a strange sound. Not a bark, not a howl, but something in between. And almost immediately, from the darkness of the forest surrounding the clearing, shadows appeared. Wolves, 5 or 6 large animals, silently emerged from behind the trees and formed a semicircle behind Gregory. Their eyes gleamed in the dark like green lanterns. "Good grief!" one of the poachers exhaled. "What kind of circus is this?" "I told you," Gregory replied calmly. "These are my friends, and right now they are very angry with you." The wolves slowly tightened their circle, moving closer to the poachers. The men shifted nervously from foot to foot, not knowing what to do. "Shoot, Nick!" one of them shouted. "What are you waiting for?" "You shoot," he snapped back. "It's a whole pack." The wolf, taking advantage of their confusion, crawled to her wounded son and licked his muzzle. He stirred weakly. "Here's the deal," Gregory said. "You have two options. First, you drop your weapons and leave. Second, we'll see who's faster, you with your rifles or the wolf pack." The poachers exchanged glances again, this time without laughter. The fear in their eyes was almost palpable. "All right, old man," the leader finally said. "We're leaving. Just tell your pets not to touch us." "They are not pets." Gregory shook his head. "They are free animals, and they will decide for themselves." He looked at the wolf, and she, as if understanding his gaze, stepped aside slightly, clearing a path to the forest trail. The poachers, abandoning their weapons, hastily retreated. When the sound of their footsteps faded in the forest, Gregory approached the wounded wolf. "How are you doing, buddy?" he asked, gently touching his neck. The wolf weakly wagged his tail. The wound was serious. The bullet had passed through his shoulder, but it didn't seem to have hit vital organs. "We need to get him home," Gregory said, addressing the wolf. "Helen will help." To his surprise, the wolf seemed to understand. She moved aside, allowing Gregory to pick up her son. The young wolf was heavy, but Gregory, despite his age, still retained considerable physical strength. He carefully hoisted the animal onto his shoulders and slowly moved towards the house. The wolf walked beside him, occasionally glancing at the human. The other wolves followed them at a distance, like an honor guard. When they reached the house, Helen was already standing on the porch, wrapped in a shawl. "Greg!" she exclaimed. "What happened?" "Poachers," he replied curtly. "Shot our charge. Get the table and instruments ready." The next 2 hours passed in tense work. Helen, recalling her medical skills, managed to extract the bullet and treat the wound. Gregory assisted her, handing her instruments and holding the wolf, who, despite the pain, did not resist. The wolf sat in the corner of the room all this time, her eyes fixed on her son and the humans helping him. "That's it," Helen finally exhaled, finishing applying the bandage. "Now he needs rest and time, lots of time." "He'll stay here," Gregory said, "until he recovers." Helen nodded, without arguing. She had long since grown accustomed to their home occasionally becoming a refuge for wild animals. "And you, Gray One," Gregory addressed the wolf, "you can come to him whenever you want. The door will be open." The wolf, as if in gratitude, approached Gregory and rubbed against his leg. Then she looked at her son, lying on the bed, whimpered softly, and headed for the exit. "Is she leaving?" Helen wondered. "Not for long," Gregory replied. "She has other children to take care of, but she'll be back." And he was right. The wolf came every day, brought prey for her son, and sat by him for hours. Gradually, the young wolf began to recover. The wound healed, and his strength returned. 2 weeks later, he could already stand on all fours and take a few steps around the room. And a week after that, he walked to the door and whimpered softly, looking at Gregory. "Want to be free?" the ranger asked. "Well, I suppose it's time." He opened the door, and the wolf slowly walked out onto the porch. There, in the yard, his mother was already waiting for him. Seeing her son, she joyfully ran to him, sniffed him, and licked his muzzle. Gregory and Helen stood on the porch, watching the reunion. Do you think they'll come back? Helen asked. Absolutely, Gregory replied confidently. Now, this is our shared family. The wolves looked back at the people standing on the porch one last time, then slowly moved towards the forest and soon disappeared among the trees. That evening, sitting by the stove, Gregory took out his old notebook and made a new entry. January 12th, 2018. The wolf with the black spot and her son. Saved from poachers. Life goes on. Closing the notebook, he smiled. The firelight reflected in his eyes, and in his heart lived the certainty that even when he and Helen were gone, the wolf pack would remember them. 3 years later, on a fine summer day, unusual guests gathered at the edge of the forest near Gregory and Helen's house. Young Ranger Alex Thorne, recently assigned to the area, sat on a stump, listening intently to the old man. Beside them, on a folding chair, sat a young woman with a notepad, a reporter for the local newspaper. "So you're claiming, Mr. Vorontsov, that this wolf pack is special?" she asked incredulously. "I'm not claiming." Gregory, who was now over 70 but still possessed a clear mind and strong body, shook his head. "I'm just telling you how it is. Whether to believe it or not is up to you. And you say that the wolves protect the forest?" Alex looked intrigued. "How so?" "See for yourself." Gregory gestured to the surroundings. "Since they've been here, not a single case of poaching. No one dares to enter the forest with ill intentions. And not just because of the wolves, of course." "Because of what else?" the journalist asked. "Because of people," the old man simply replied. "You see, when the wolves started protecting the forest, people noticed, and gradually, how can I put it? They were moved. They understood that the forest isn't just trees, but a living organism, and we are all part of it." Alex nodded thoughtfully. "I've heard stories from the locals. They say you practically talk to these wolves." Gregory laughed. "They exaggerate, of course, but we understand each other. That, yes." "And is it true that the wolf with the black spot on her chest is the same one you saved as a pup almost 20 years ago?" the journalist persisted. "True," Gregory nodded. "Only she's getting on in years now. Wolves in the wild rarely live to 15, and she's almost 17. But she's still spirited, still the pack leader." "Can I write an article about this?" The girl brightened. "The Forest Alliance, or something like that. About how one family changed a whole community's attitude towards nature." "Write it," Gregory shrugged, "just without too many embellishments. And you don't have to use my name. It's not about me." "Then what is it about?" Alex asked. Gregory pondered. "About understanding, I suppose. About how everything in this world is connected. Man and beast, forest and field, river and sky, all one. And when you understand that, you can't live the old way anymore." They fell silent. Somewhere deep in the forest, a woodpecker tapped, as if confirming the old man's words. "Mr. Vorontsov," Alex said seriously, "I would like you to, well, how can I say it? Pass on your knowledge to me. About the forest, about the animals, about all of it. I'm a city boy, ended up in the Forest Service by chance. But you have immense experience." The old man looked intently at the young ranger. "And why do you want that?" "I want to learn to understand the forest like you do," Alex simply replied. "I want to become not just an official with a badge, but a true guardian, so that the forest trusts me, as it trusts you." Gregory smiled. "Well, come tomorrow. We'll start from the beginning. And bring a notebook. You'll be taking notes." When the young people left, Gregory sat by the forest edge for a long time, watching the sunset. The sun painted the treetops gold, and the entire forest seemed magical, enchanted. Suddenly, he noticed movement in the bushes. Looking closer, he saw the wolf, the very one with the black spot on her chest. She stood motionless, gazing at him with her wise yellow eyes. "You heard everything, didn't you?" Gregory asked softly. "Don't worry. This boy's a good one. We'll teach him the ropes, and he'll be your friend when I'm gone." The wolf blinked, as if understanding. Then she turned and silently disappeared into the forest. Gregory stood up, leaning on his stick, and slowly moved towards the house. Walking along the path, he noticed tracks on the damp earth, wolf tracks, running parallel to his own. They were everywhere, in front, behind, beside him. As if the pack had invisibly accompanied him all these years, guarding and protecting him. "A forest debt," the old man murmured, smiling. "Everything comes back around." In the direction where the wolf had gone, a soft howl was heard. One voice, then a second, a third. The entire pack greeted the coming night, or perhaps said farewell to the fading day. Or maybe they simply reminded the humans, "We are here, we are near, we are part of one whole." Gregory stopped and listened. In this wolf chorus he heard the ancient song of the forest, a song he loved with all his heart, and which new generations would now have to hear. After all, debts must be paid, even if it is a forest debt. Thank you for watching. If you want more stories like this, please like, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. It helps us create even more exciting stories.